There's something I do every winter that is not necessarily associated with black people, and that is skiing. The reason that I started skiing is because of my tenure as a reporter at This Week News, a chain of suburban newspapers in my hometown, Columbus, Ohio, that unfortunately is permanently shutting down this month. When I say skiing isn't necessarily associated with black people, let me clarify that I know there are plenty of accomplished black skiers. There are black skiers clubs all over the nation, including a local chapter that a friend of mine has repeatedly invited me to join, but as of yet I haven't gotten around to signing up. Another thing I need to clarify is that I'm not a great skier, but I'm not bad, and I hit the slopes once every winter, sort of like how some people go to amusement parks every summer to get their thrills riding roller coasters. Oftentimes when I go to ski resorts, I am one of the few black people there. How did I get interested in skiing? Because I attended the media day that a Central Ohio ski resort hosted in 2007. The ski resort, Mad River Mountain, about an hour northwest of Columbus, offered free ski lessons for the media that day. At the time, I was a full-time reporter at This Week News. I was in my mid-30s, and I had never even tried on a pair of skis before. Though I had never thought about skiing before that day that I participated in the Media Day event at Mad River Mountain, my public high school in inner city East Columbus, Eastmore, had a ski club. The school was about 60% black and 40% white when I attended in the late 1980s. I don't know how many black kids were on the ski club, but I certainly wasn't one of them. But that day at Mad River Mountain, I surprisingly took to skiing like a bird to flight. I love the feeling of whizzing down the slopes. Maybe it's because I'm a shy, reserved person that I experience skiing as a way to cut loose and let go. Learning to ski is just one of the many fond memories I have of the 20-plus years I spent working in various capacities at This Week News. Other memorable moments include interviewing some of the biggest movers and shakers in the world. In a previous video about my time as a community news reporter, and I'll put the link to that video in the description box, I spoke about how my work for the newspaper led me to find out about the black women from my hometown who integrated pro wrestling in the 1950s. I interviewed Ethel Johnson, the first black women's world wrestling champion, for the newspaper, and later adapted the article into a documentary titled Lady Wrestler: The Amazing Untold Story of African American Women in the Ring. Other history makers whom I had the privilege of interviewing during my tenure at This Week News include Jerry Mock, an American pilot and the first woman to fly solo around the world. I'm proud to say Mock was a Central Ohio native, and she lived for many years in Bexley, one of the communities I was assigned to cover for This Week. I also interviewed Candace Bushnell, best-selling author and journalist whose New York Observer column was adapted into the wildly successful Sex and the City TV series and movies. Another author I had the privilege of interviewing was Alexander McCall Smith, the British writer who wrote the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series that was adapted into a TV show starring R&B superstar Jill Scott. I also interviewed PBS Antiques Roadshow host Dan Elias. This interview really impressed my father, Fred, who's a big fan of the show. One of the biggest celebrities I met during my time at This Week was Jon Stewart, comedian and former host of The Daily Show, who was in Columbus to receive the Thurber Prize for Humor. A lot of performers have an over-the-top on-stage persona and a quieter off-stage persona, and that seemed to be the case with Jon Stewart. Being a shy, reserved person myself, it took a lot for me to work up the nerve to approach him. And when I met him at the Center of Science and Industry, the sprawling downtown venue in Columbus where the award ceremony was being held, Jon Stewart was standing in a corner by himself, staring out a window. He seemed a bit taken off guard when I went up to him, introduced myself, and told him I was a big fan. He was gracious, shook my hand, and thanked me, and I quickly left him to return to his private thoughts. In addition to world-famous stars, I also had the opportunity to get to know a lot of local celebrities, interesting characters, such as a longtime Southside activist known as Mama Lizzie. Whenever I spoke with this lovely elderly black lady, she treated me like I was part of her family, ending the conversation with, "Mama Lizzie loves you." Throughout my tenure at This Week News, I'm proud to say that I never missed a deadline. On a trip to Costa Rica in Central America in 2022, and another overseas trip to Senegal and Gambia in Africa in 2019, I wrote enough stories in advance to send to my editors at This Week for them to run in my absence. In May 2017, when I ventured to the famous Cannes Film Festival in the French Riviera to promote the Lady Wrestler documentary, I wrote stories on my iPad in my hotel room in the south of France. And I also wrote stories in a train station on an excursion between Cannes and Paris. I wrote about things going on in Columbus that I'd covered ahead of time before I left for the trip, and I emailed the stories halfway across the world to my editor so as not to miss the weekly deadline. When I went to Cannes, I made plans to meet up at Disneyland Paris with a former This Week News co-worker of mine. He and his family had moved to Europe. I have to say that my friendship with this former This Week sports reporter was an unlikely one. And that's because I have very little knowledge of sports, in spite of the fact that I made an entire documentary about the history of wrestling. And even though I enjoy skiing, I've always been pretty uncoordinated and non-athletic. The way that this sports reporter and I became friends is through a project that This Week News launched in 2007. We called it the Vodcast, and it was a weekly online video newscast summarizing some of the top stories going on in Central Ohio that week. I hosted and produced the Vodcast and worked with This Week's sports reporters to film their segments. Before the Vodcast, I had very little interaction with sports reporters, but I once heard someone say, "Sweat is the best cement." What that means is working alongside each other forms a bond, and working on the Vodcast definitely formed a bond between my This Week co-workers and I. The former sports reporter who had moved to Europe with his wife and kids is just one of my This Week colleagues who have gone on to do great things all around the world. My colleagues are now living and working in places as far away as Shanghai, China. It's interesting that a so-called hyper-local publication has produced so many world-class talents. To prepare for making this video, I went skiing a couple days ago. It was a Friday night at the end of a long, busy week, and to be quite honest, I really didn't feel like going anywhere or doing anything strenuous. Skiing is an activity that, although I enjoy it, it's so outside of the realm of my everyday existence that if I don't push myself to do it, it's easy to find excuses not to do it. And I knew that if I kept procrastinating, I'd look up one day and winter will have passed by without me hitting the slopes. So I'm glad I pushed myself to go skiing this past Friday night. As is always the case, when I first put on my skis, I was a little wobbly. It took me a while to find my sea legs, or snow legs as it were. I warmed up on the bunny slopes, which are the lowest hills and are designed for children and others who are just learning how to ski. The bunny slopes are in fact where I first learned to ski in 2007 at that Media Day event. That feeling of gliding down a slope is exhilarating, and soon I moved on from the bunny slopes and ventured to one of the steeper slopes that are geared toward more experienced skiers. You have to take a lift to get to those more challenging slopes. As the night wore on, I went down that steeper slope over and over. I surprised myself that even though a year had gone by since the last time I skied, my years of skiing experience took over. It was like riding a bicycle, as the old adage goes. Muscle memory helped me navigate the steeper slope, easily maneuvering around other skiers who were going slower than me and also avoiding collisions with snowboarders who had tumbled down in front of me. Each time I reached the bottom of the slope, I felt like I had conquered something, overcame or at least confronted my shyness and fear of the world in general. Skiing helps me push past my boundaries and let go of limiting beliefs. On Friday night, I had only planned to stay at the ski resort for a short time, but I ended up staying until they closed at 10 p.m. And by the time I left, I realized that steep slope that I kept going down is no longer a challenge. The next time I go skiing, I need to tackle an even higher hill in order to keep upgrading my skills. My experience on the ski slopes is a metaphor for life. Now that This Week News has folded, I'm ready to take on new challenges. Just as I had to take a lift to get to that steeper ski slope, I'm ready to take my writing and filmmaking career to higher levels. I'd love to know what challenges you're taking on this year. Please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.